And so we set those deep, deep, deep pathways that we've gone over 100 different times, 100 million different times during our formative years. And then as our brains start to solidify, if we take a different path that feels uncomfortable, right? Because now we're outside of the road that has been established. And if you're driving, you drive on the shoulder of a car, it's like brrr, the rumble strips, right? And you're like, whoa, I got to get back in my lane.
In a world that often pulls us apart, More in Common brings us back to what matters. Hosted by Gerren Taylor and Keith Richardson, this isn't your average podcast. It's a challenge to think deeper, question louder, and grow further. At More in Common, we work with NFL teams, tech companies, and professionals across industries to improve communication and foster compassion. And with a focus on emotional intelligence, we aim to bring a wealth of experience to help you navigate the complexities of human connection. We've never been more connected and yet more isolated. We want to explore the roots of that tension and offer a way back to what we all need: real human connection. Enjoy the show.
I have 4 dogs.
Wow.
I have, starting at the biggest, I have a 120-pound English Mastiff. I have, an 80-pound Lab Mutt mix. I have a little French Bulldog. And then our most recent addition is a little Bulldog Mutt mix thing that is just the cutest little grumpy old man face that you've ever seen. So,
Aw.
yeah, it's kind of we don't have the kids, but we do the dogs big time. And I foster sometimes too. So at times there
Wow.
have been 5 to 6 dogs in my household.
Okay, see, that's a lot.
That's a lot.
You said
That's
it.
a lot.
You said it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. It's a
Yeah.
lot.
Well,
Hey,
everybody, welcome
I-
to the More in Common podcast. We have a guest this week. I'm Gerren Taylor. That's Keith Richardson. And our guest is Kelly Brinkman, who is a presenter and generational dynamics expert at Bridgeworks, where she helps workplaces build stronger collaboration across generations. With degrees in journalism, sociology, plus an MBA, she brings research and real-world insight to today's evolving workforce. A proud millennial, Kelly blends cultural perspective with data-driven strategy, and she's also a 2-time Olympic trials marathoner, bringing the same resilience and discipline from elite athletics into her work, helping organizations navigate generational change. And she loves dogs.
Guilty. All true.
I love
All
dogs.
true.
Loves dogs.
Absolutely.
Well,
Thank you guys for having me.
Oh my God, I'm so excited to have you. And for the 5 people that have paid attention for the last 7 years of the journey of our podcast, Kelly works with a company called Bridgeworks that the owner and founder, Phil Gwokey, was on our Empty Cup series several years ago. I actually sent it to you, Kelly. Did you watch it?
I did.
Yeah.
And so normally I consider myself a baby boomer with technology, but I totally went the Z route and I listened to it in 2 times speed because I was
Yeah.
trying to get multiple things done. But it was great. I mean, it's right on point. And it's funny because it's the same, different, right? We have similar issues today. It's just new groups and new dynamics with the traits of the different groups now in the workforce.
So
And I love this
that
conversation in general too,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
as we grow, like you're saying, technologically, and being able to put these names on these kind of generational differences that have grown through access to technology and how we use it, it's important, I think. And that's the kind of the work you guys do, right? At Bridgeworks, talk about this and how it works.
Yeah, our name is not a mistake. The whole bridging the gaps between the generations is what we do. And, as I mentioned, when Phil was on several years ago, it was sort of, the Generation Z was this new interesting puzzle piece that nobody quite knew how to handle. How are we going to, how is their entrance into the workforce going to affect us? And now, the oldest Gen Zers are coming up on 30. And so some of them have been in the workforce for decades. Some of them are in or approaching management and leading positions. I actually did a presentation this last week and I had a young lady, Gen Zer, who owns her own advertising agency. And she came up and she was like, "You are are spot on with so much of what you said. Like, I want to be ambitious, but nobody knows how to handle me because I come to them as a Zer and they're like, what? You own your own business? That's not a typical Z trait. So they're very confused with my approach. But yeah, it's a Bridgeworks, we're really about connecting people, bridging those gaps, understanding, acknowledging the differences, looking for the value in those differences, and then being flexible to incorporate and collaborate with all the generations.
That's
In that
awesome. So, like, I
generational
think,
differences. Go ahead, Keith.
I think what's interesting about a lot of the things that we talk about, assumptions and how assumptions get in the way of human connection and our ability to make meaningful progress because of our judgments. And what I always find fascinating is these judgments and assumptions are informed by all kinds of things that we just don't have time to filter through relative to what's true. We just take things at the surface because our brains, for all intents and purposes, as computationally smart as they are, they're dumb and they make shortcuts. And that's a whole survival mechanism, right? We talk a lot about survival. It's pretty much the theme of our show all the time.
Yeah.
So to kick this conversation off, I think would be really great to level set on how generations are determined and what really defines these generations relative to their experience, not so much the periods of time that they might
Yeah,
create.
that's a great starting off point because you're exactly right. It's not necessarily about the chronological age of someone, it's about the fact that similar groups of people experience similar events and conditions. So what we talk about in Bridgeworks is like the actual physiology of the brain, right? Because when you're young, your brain is soft. Like that's why we have those, soft skull, like don't, that kind of thing, protect your head. And so that everything we go through, experience, see in the world, live through, are absorbing in our teenage years, we call that our formative experience or our formative years. And that sort of, I describe it as setting sort of your sense of what's normal, right? Like what's the normal music that you're used to? What is a normal, afternoon watching television like? What is, if you have to write a paper for school, are you pulling out the typewriter and the whiteout? Or are you, asking Chat GPT to give you 3 different versions of your paper, right? So everything. And so what happens is the generations are about, like an 15 to 20-year range because that's the formative development period of our brains. It's setting our cognitive framework, it's setting our expectations of normal values, behaviors, traits, characteristics. And then as the situations around us change, the next group of people are now experiencing different events and conditions in their formative years. So now because they're experiencing different things, their expectations can't help but be changed. And the fact that, again, a whole cohort of people is experiencing the same or similar events and conditions, they can't help but be shaped similarly. And one example I like to use in my presentations is, if you ever talked to a grandparent or a great grandparent who lived through the Great Depression, I mean, now we're kind of getting past that point where there are a lot of those people left, but they had very specific values and beliefs about money, about banks, about credit cards, about work ethic because they knew what it was like to go through real scarcity. I mean, absolute devastation economically, everything, consumption, consumerism, all of that. And so that couldn't help but shape their mindset. Those are the type of people who are hiding money under the mattress, who never had a credit card their whole life, who didn't trust banks, and then an evolution evolves. You see, somebody like the baby boomers who experienced the post World War II boom of economy, of patriotism, of like the American dream. And you see a whole different mindset around what's possible and the attitude towards work behavior, consumerism, all of that.
Keep going. Like, no. So what I mean is, because I think what you just did, as we made it, it was academic at first, but then really the experiential element of these generations relative to going as far back as the greatest generation in the Great Depression to, baby boomers, and then keep going. Like, because
Yeah, yeah,
millennials get a whole hard time, right? Gen Xers, like this whole thing, and you see online people will be like, Gen Xers are the great, blah, 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 right? Like people
yes.
create these
Yep.
narratives around it. But I want to hear the continued evolution of this. Yeah.
Yeah. So to make sure everybody's on the same page, so baby boomers are four main generations active in the workforce right now. Baby boomers who are born 1946 to 1964. There were 80 million of them. There was one baby born every 8 seconds during this generation. And they also went through things like, the Vietnam War in their formative experience. They went through oil embargoes. They were a huge counterculture. They were the Woodstock, so there were all these things shaping them to be a very competitive driven generation, very formal, very professional, because a lot of their society was based on military hierarchy, right? Like you came home, your parents would ask you to do something and there was no back talk, there was no question, like you just did what they said, or the teacher at school or your coach. It was like they were the authority figure. That's, what they say jump, you say, you don't even say anything, you just jump, right? And then the next generation came along, Gen X. They were our, or have been so far, our smallest generation in US history. Those are the people born 1965 to 1980. They were unique because every generation has gone through some sort of dissonance or disruption, which we'll get to obviously with Gen Z and COVID. But Gen X went through a lot of this, the AIDS epidemic, the crack epidemic, Watergate, huge economic recessions, the American family, not to put it lightly, but sort of crumbling. The divorce rate during this generation tripled. So now you have a lot of latchkey kids who are home alone, who are navigating this new sort of scary landscape by themselves. There was no gentle parenting. There was no sitting down and saying, how do you feel about the fact that you saw the spaceship Challenger explode on TV in your classroom? It was, I joked in my presentation this week, like Generation X, you were sort of the feral generation. Like, you have been adulting since you were 8. Like, you know how to get stuff done because you had to. You had to be resilient because that was your only choice. And so the other thing is, next generation, we see the millennials, the second largest generation. So X is sandwiched between the two largest generations. They often feel like, again, generational anecdote here, but they feel like Jan Brady, right? Like, you're the lost middle child. Like, I'm not Marsha. I'm not sweet little Cindy. Like, I am the forgotten generation. And because they're so assured and efficient and reliant on themselves, you do kind of lose sight of them in the workplace. They're the type of people who are going to be like, this meeting could have been an email. Like, I want to do my thing. I want to get done. I want to get out of here. So, that is a very, a lot of them are their second largest generation active in the workforce now. A lot of them are in management positions at the peak of their careers, but then also handling a huge full load of personal obligations and responsibilities. Something like 60% of them are dealing with aging parents and then helping financially with adult children. And if Keith, this one's for you, because I heard your kids in the background earlier. The average age American children are permanently leaving their parents' home. Do you want to guess?
25.
7.
Yeah.
So if you had told a baby boomer, like my parents, baby boomers, they were married, had a kid on the way when they were 19 and 20, and like moved out, moved on. My grandparent, the traditionalist, he moved out when he was 16 and started making it on his own. The Generation X is going, what the heck? How come I'm suddenly having to deal with everybody, right? And then millennials, 1981 to 1996, we were the first generation where it was the participation trophy, the self-esteem movement. You're getting invited to the table. Your parents are asking you what you think and how you feel, and everybody matters. We're also the first generation, the early adopters of modern technology. I can remember my Nokia cell phone. I'm an older millennial, so I was late stage high school and early stage college. But like the fact that I had my own tool of communication and I could call anybody at any time, usually after 9 p.m., because that's when minutes were free. But, it was this new evolution, and formality sort of starts to leak out of there, and we start blending our personal and our professional. It's no longer, I'm two separate people, one at work and one at home. I'm starting to blend those two. And then we get to, our Zers, who are the newest in the workforce, and we see, number one, they haven't fully gone through their evolution. The youngest members of this generation are only 14. So they still have a few more years of development and how they'll turn out is yet to be fully realized. But what we're seeing from them, the biggest questions companies will come to us is like, how do I motivate a Zir? How come they're not staying around? How come they're so demanding and impatient and entitled? Well, think about the world they grew up in. They've never known a world without smartphones. Something like 95 to 98% of 13 to 17-year-olds in the United States have a smartphone. So you now have a super computer in the palm of your hand where at any time from anywhere, you can Google how to do something. You can see, and the other thing is like this whole perception versus reality, right? Because on the screen, everything everyone is doing looks so perfect and so fantastic. And they're all millionaires making it big and doing their own branding and influencers. And that plays a mind trick on these young people thinking like, I'm not good enough. They get into the workforce, and I have heard over and over again reports of imposter syndrome, because they're like, nobody, I feel like I don't know what I don't know, but I'm too scared to ask. I feel like people are judging me on day one. I feel like my response to certain situations is different because my formative years were different. I want to ask for help versus previous generations who kind of had to figure it out for themselves. So it's a very different, the experiences that these people have had, the technology they've had, what that technology has done to their brains has created very big distinctions from generation to generation. And that's why at Bridgeworks, we try to, number one, again, create that awareness. Like, listen, they are not asking to be promoted because they think they're the best thing since sliced bread. They're asking to be promoted because the tech cycle in their lifetime, which has been the prominent thing that they interact with, those cell phones, those computers, those passwords, change every 6 months, every 9 months, every 12 months. So in their minds, the cycle of change is that quick. Like that's how
Mm.
things happen. And if they don't, then something's wrong. So they can't help but get into the workplace and go, why am I not advancing in a year? Like I've got 5 new cell phones in the last year. And, why aren't things working that way? And even on demand, like I always joke with my audiences, if you're watching Netflix or you're watching whatever streaming service and it gets to the end of the episode and it gives you that 10-second countdown, how many of you wait the 10 seconds? Like
Mhm.
nobody, right?
Yeah.
We we have our cognitive framework, but we're all still malleable as we get older and we get accustomed to those things. I know I love Amazon Prime, right? I love shopping for my living room at 10 o'clock at night and can get it the next day if I order in the next 2 hours, right? So to criticize these young people for some of the expectations and the behaviors they have when we as adults are starting to adopt some of them ourselves is very hypocritical.
And how do you see that manifesting today? Because it's obviously creating some sort of strict friction in the workplace, as far as feedback, expectations, loyalty versus mobility, and what people are looking for. How does that manifest for you in your work?
So those qualities, Garen, that you were talking about are certainly have been shaped again by each generation. Like I said, baby boomers, it was sort of the blind loyalty. You trust authorities because that's who's in charge. And why would they lie? Why would they deceive you? They want the best outcome. So there was this blind trust. So building trust with baby boomers, it's like this innate thing. Building loyalty with baby boomers is sort of innate given quality. Like if you ask baby boomers about their average tenure at their first job, it's 10, 5, 7, 10 years because that was the thing that you did. And then you get to Generation X, who I mentioned, saw all that disruption, had to handle it themselves, had to process it themselves, saw their families struggling, saw businesses struggling, saw, high-ranking officials failing people and being deceitful. And so for them, trust is like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You need to earn my trust. Like you need to give me data points. You need to prove yourself. We need follow through on commitments. What you say, you better do. So they're going to be a little bit slower to adopt trust and loyalty. And loyalty really is a struggle too, because again, they saw baby boomer parents sacrifice, go in early and stay late for the company to toe the company line. And they didn't see a lot of reward or didn't reap a lot of benefit. Or the Gen X children felt dismissed by the parents because the parents were choosing their career over their family. And so Gen X said, we want to change that a little bit. And millennials took it even a step further because now we have tools. We can be more efficient on the job with our technology. We are talking about self-esteem. We are talking to adults as young people. So now, we should be invited to the table. If you want my trust, if you want my loyalty from day one, I want to be part of the big picture. If I have a question, I want to be able to go to the CEO and knock on his or her door and say, hey, these are my thoughts. I have ideas to innovate because we have these new tools. Even things like social media, right? They have been able to look up YouTube tutorials or, how to whatever and do things themselves or new ways because of the access they have to the new tools available online. And then Z, as I mentioned, they're tricky because on one hand, they're a very industrious generation. They have been able to have access times two to what millennials had to learn how to do things for themselves. I mean, they start in you look at reality TV and such, and there's all these competitions where little kids are doing, adult skills from a very young age or becoming influencers from a very young age because they can, right? And so when they get in the workforce, again, they want to make an impact from day one. But the drawback to that, again, is that fear of being judged, the fear of failure. They feel that they're not enough as they are because they don't have a roadmap to follow. Their whole lives, they've learned from rubrics, from elementary school to college, they're given this roadmap. If you want this outcome, these are the steps you need to take. And then they get into the workforce. And those of us who have been in the workforce often know that's not the case. Like you may go through a new job orientation where you learn the technology, you kind of learn the culture and the vibe, but there's not like a step by step. What do you do each day? And so Zers feel a little bit disoriented from that. And I always like to remind each generation, like, you went through that too. You might not remember it at the stage you're at now, but you went through that same struggle. And how we dealt with it differed. But when you put yourself in their position, like, how nice, I think back, it's like, how nice would it have been if somebody would have sat down with me and outlined, this is your career path here. These are some of the steps you need to take. Here's how long it's going to take, and here's why. Like, it would have been so helpful, but, every generation before them has had to sort of figure it out for themselves. But Z is coming to the table being open and vulnerable enough to say, I've been guided my whole life. I would like to continue that guidance. And they're very adaptable. They're very coachable. They're very open to that. They have skills and competencies. They just learn and react in a different way than any previous generation.
So I'm curious. I have a lot of questions, and I recognize that we're going to have multiple conversations with you. So I want to anchor on one in particular, relative to this element of formative years. I think there's an instinct for us, generally speaking, to conflate it all and talk about the people, the human experience, right? And then we add in this variable of industrial revolution. Everything has changed so fast, right? Everything has changed so fast, so fast, so fast. And really what we're focused on is the last 150 years. But the reality of it is, regardless of the pace of change, those formative years are always those formative years, right? So how do we break out of that perception? How do we break out of this perception that it's not about the pace of change per se? It's just about how you're experiencing that pace of change during that window of time of development as a human being. Does
Yeah,
that make
that's
sense?
yeah, I think and actually that sort of what my mind first jumps to is I will have, participants of our workshops or our presentations come up after and be like, do you think the generations will start getting smaller and smaller because of the pace of change of technology?
Yeah, that was a
My
first thought I actually
Yeah,
started. I was going to ask you
yeah,
that question, but then I'm
yeah,
like, that doesn't actually make sense relative to everything
yes.
you just said.
Yes, and you're absolutely right because the response is it's not about the environment per se in terms of a generation or a formative experience. Those are the influencing factors, but the formative experience itself is that brain development, right? And so
Right.
that will always be that same sort of structure of years until there's a huge, evolution in human development, so to
A
speak.
million
And
years
so,
from now.
yeah, next week things are going to
Yeah, that's
change.
right.
No.
Our brain is gonna change next week. Yeah.
Yeah, but it is rooted in the idea that it has to do with the amount that our brain and the time that our brain needs to develop. And so a lot of times during that time period, we're experiencing sort of the same events and conditions, the same daily behaviors over and over as our minds are soft. So that's sort of, if we're thinking about our brains as those grooves or those neural pathways, those ones that we travel when our brains are soft are going to be the deepest rutted, the most distinct pathways, right? And so we set those deep, deep, deep pathways that we've gone over 100 different times, 100 million different times during our formative years. And then as our brains start to solidify, if we take a different path that feels uncomfortable, right? Because now we're outside of the road that has been established. And if you're driving, you drive on the shoulder of a car, it's like brrr, the rumble strips, right? And you're like, whoa, I got to get back in my lane. And that's sort of the analogy to what our formative years versus what the expectations are after. And the knee-jerk reaction of human response is if something is different, that is uncomfortable, and I do not want to go experience that, right? So we jump right back in our path. And the fact of the matter is, this is where we have to talk about going from a sociological perspective of generations down to an individual level and say, some people will be more comfortable riding on that shoulder and being like, okay, I'm not crashing. It's uncomfortable, but I'm not crashing. Maybe I'm learning something new. Maybe, the longer I drive in this, the smaller those little bumps will get. And pretty soon that part of the road will be smoother. And now, and in scientific terms, we're talking about neuroplasticity and
Mhm.
creating different pathways. As adults, it takes longer. It's more uncomfortable. It's not natural. And so some people won't make that effort and they will stay in those defined roles. They will live in those stereotypes that make interactions easy because we can just jump to those assumptions versus actually breaking out of the box and being like, okay, why is this person acting this way though? And can we have a conversation about it and then come to some sort of common ground in between maybe what's natural and comfortable for me and what's natural and comfortable for them? And that's really sort of the whole, formative experience discussion in a very simplistic example. But I, I,
There
I think that kind
Yeah,
of
I think you
answers.
nailed it
it
as far
does.
as
Yeah.
condensed. I
Yeah.
love the rumble strip analogy though, as well, because it definitely, and there are those people who will go off-roading and they're like, you know
Yeah.
what? Let's go see what's out there.
So I think
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting element that we could cover in the last few minutes of this week that you just bring up. And this is just generally again, I mean, this is a lot of the angle that we come from, the lens of the brain, just finding ways, neural pathways to make things repeatable and easy over time. It is a survival mechanism at the end of the day. But in sociological research, and I love the way that you frame that, bring it from sociological to the individual. General research in psychology and sociology is looking at the predominance of activity, which can net anywhere from, let's say, 5 to 60% of a population. But that still leaves a significant amount of people who have a personal experience that is different than the stereotype that we're generalizing
Yes.
for the purposes of these. So the question is very academic in this case. What is the generally accepted experience percentage for each generation in the research so that we can just kind of get a sense of what that is, so we can separate the fact that, yeah, you might have a personally different experience than that, and that's okay. It doesn't it's just what it is, right?
Yep. So off the top of my head, I'll just be transparent. I don't
Love it.
know the
Fair
percentages.
enough.
But I will say, like you were talking about, it's that individual influence and how powerful some of those other elements of our development are in those formative
Mm.
years. For example, we talk a lot about, culture and geography. If you are growing up, again, I've given presentations for global audiences of, some of the biggest companies. So I will have people come up to me after and say, hey, I am from Kenya and my literal village did not have technology. I did not have a cell phone until, the year 2000, and I was in my 30s. And so that development, or that, the events and conditions for that culture have now shifted because of the reality of that situation. Same with people, who maybe had, like, my family, my parents, baby boomers, were very, very present in my life. So my family structure had a huge role in shaping my perceptions and my beliefs, which is why I always joke that I'm like a millennial trapped in a boomer body. Like, I forget to plug in my computer, and I have to write down my passwords in my little password notebook. Like, I have a lot of those traits because of my familial influence. So again, percentages, I don't know, but that's a very important distinction to make, is that generations is going to be our overarching, because again, it is essentially everybody falling under, as long as you're in the same area or, like, country, things like that, you're essentially experiencing the same moment in time. Events, especially, no matter where you were in the world, you felt and heard COVID-19. No matter where you were in the world, 9/11 probably showed up on the radar. So there are these certain national and global events that are going to resonate with a generation, regardless of what those other elements of development are. But yeah, certainly, like I always tell people, this is, when I do my presentation, this is a sociological view. I do not have time to do the individual snowflake view, but that would be really fun. I'd
Well,
love to
it just
pick
goes to
all
show
of your
that
brains.
these
Yeah.
generational conflicts, it's not about your age, it's about your context, right? It's about the different economic, technological, and cultural things that were happening around you as you were being formed. And that workplace tension you feel is all of these things, like, you know, existing in friction against one another.
Absolutely. I mean, even things like, how you handle a conflict situation. Like, a lot of times, your general or generational influence will be one of the forefront. But if you saw different conflict resolution behavior modeled in your home, that might override the generational influence because it was something that was closer to you that you saw more often. So, yeah, again, and that's why I think it's so like, your podcast in general, it's about the human experience, right? It's about connection. If we're take 5 minutes when you onboard a new person to your organization and sit down and just talk a little bit about, the human experience. What have you done in your life? What has left a mark on you? What are you looking to get out of these things? And just taking a moment to be humans relating to one another, I think, is going to resonate no matter what generation, no matter what formative experience anyone has been through.
Amazing. Well, I will say all of that helps me frame how I grew up as an only child in a divorced household from the time I was 2, and why I resonate so much more with Gen Xers than I do with millennials. And now I understand why that is the
Yeah.
case. But
Yes.
with that said, we are at time for the week. So as fast as that went, we are going to come back next week with a lot more to unpack. Gerren,
I
bring
want to
us
dig into
out.
some other things and personal experiences and talk about why us elder millennials are just the best. No,
Yes. I say that in my presentation when I'm outlining the generations. I'm like, baby boomers, Gen X, the best generation, and Zers. It's millennials.
we do it all. It's like
That's
like
right.
Hamilton.
Sorry, not sorry.
All right.
This is the
Well,
More in Common podcast. I'm Gerren. That's Keith. We'll be back with Kelly again next week. Thanks for joining us and have fun.
Thanks, guys.